Hey, listeners, welcome back to Sustainability Street, our podcast on the intersection of commercial real estate and the world we live in. I'm your host, Therese Fitzgerald. Mass timber is a visually appealing and fast-growing way to lower embodied carbon in new construction. But just how low carbon is it? And are there ways to maximize the amount of carbon saved? My guest for this episode is Varun Kohli, Director of Sustainability at Corgan, a global architecture and design firm. Kohli's department embarked on a study to really understand the benefits of mass timber and the nuances and decisions that impact those benefits. The results of their study are really helping dispel some of the myths about mass timber. And a carbon calculator for architects and designers now sits on the firm's website. I think you'll really enjoy listening to our conversation, and I think you'll learn a few things about mass timber that'll surprise you. Hi, Varun. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Therese. Thanks for having me.
So before we start talking about mass timber and what your firm has found about mass timber, tell us a bit about Corgan, and then tell us about your role there and what your areas of interest are.
Sure. So I'm Varun. I'm the head of sustainability or director of sustainability for Corgan. I'm also a principal with the firm based out of the New York office. Corgan's a very large international architecture and design practice. We have about 19 offices. We're approaching around 1,200 staff across the world. Our biggest office is in Dallas, but New York is our second largest office. And, we do work in every sector, starting from aviation, data centers, interiors, healthcare, education, you name it, commercial. So we're pretty wide in the type of work that we do, and definitely do it across the country and now expanding in the global market.
So let's talk about mass timber. It's really growing in popularity. Tell us what you've seen in your practice and in the industry, and what you think is driving that growth.
Yeah. Um, well, mass timber has become really popular, primarily being driven by the fact that it has, it's been assumed, but to some degree, it is very low carbon material, right? And so when developers and owners are trying to meet either their ESG targets or this becomes a really good, viable material. There's other advantages, obviously, to mass timber. One is aesthetics. I mean, it's a material that is really desirable by the end user.
Mm-hmm.
We also know the health benefits of being around natural materials, so there's that advantage. There's definitely some advantage to doing fabricated material, which helps with the speed of construction. Obviously, there's some, costs involved in additional capex, but we often see a payback pretty quickly, given that, products with mass timber end up being higher premium products in the market, or, products that are fully occupied or used even in times of downturn.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the misconceptions about mass timber uh, that made Corgan want to conduct this research that
Yeah.
you've done?
It came from a research paper that we saw that was published late in 2023 by the WRI, the World Resources Institute. And basically, the paper was suggesting that our industry was not accounting for some of the biogenic carbon that comes into play. That has mostly to do with the forestry practices. And essentially, in the standards that we currently use, we do not account for some of the forestry or biogenic carbon at the early stage of fabrication of mass timber. So in essence, what we're saying, and our industry does is says we're going to start where the log comes into place into a fabrication facility, and that from that point on, we're accounting for the carbon associated with it. So we miss out on some of these early biogenic carbon, which is essentially the carbon that the trees have sequestered over life. And there's a debate about it. Where do you start? When do you stop? When do you start accounting for it? And us as a team of sustainability experts within Corgan, we decided to kind of take this on and say, you know what, let's look at it. Let's look at what the question, let's expand the boundary and account for that biogenic carbon that's typically not accounted for. And there were some really interesting outcomes. And the big thing was when we accounted for some of these extra emissions and we brought it back into our sort of analysis of comparison between mass timber and concrete and steel in a typical office building, even with those additional carbon emissions, we found that mass timber was still a better product in terms of carbon emissions. So mass timber still remains a much better product in terms of emissions, even though we may not have been accounting for everything.
Yeah. Is that what I think slag the term about what's slash?
So it is assumed that you get about, not assumed, it's been sort of estimated that from the beginning of a tree down to the timber that ends up in a building, we probably lose around 60+% of that tree. Slash really refers to the pieces of tree or the portions of the tree that are left behind in the forest. Everything from roots to the bark, the small branches, all of that is left behind in the forest, and that's referred to as slash. Forestry practices have different ways of managing that slash. They would either burn that on site or sometimes just left on the forest floor. Different ways of managing slash can result in different emission values. That's the key stuff that we accounted for. And what we found was, again, that is a large component of the biogenic carbon that's lost. Again, it still keeps mass timber ahead of the other products that are available in the market for structure and for envelope.
Are there ways to process it or produce it that would improve those things?
Absolutely. And I want to mention a couple of other factors that really play a key role in the emissions. One, obviously, yes, how we manage the slash is important. Mastification is one way of reducing the emissions. Now, while that plays a key role, we know that there are other reasons for managing that slash. One is forest fires. To reduce forest fires, there are certain practices that are in place. So it sometimes may or may not be easy to avoid that, right? But if there are ways we can use some of those byproducts of the tree, if it's small branches, can we use some of these products to make pencils, for example? And there is industry practices where this happens. So the more we can try to use the byproduct, we can reduce those emissions. That's number one. The other thing we found was the variable that really impacts the emissions is also the type of trees that we use. So if you're using a southern pine versus another wood species, you will see a variation in the amount of emissions that are associated with it. And that also has to do with how much slash is left behind. So I think our point was really to kind of demystify this portion of emissions so that as a designer, as architects, when we get involved with projects, or as building owners or property developers, when you get involved with the project, that we ask the right questions, right? Like, where are we getting the tree or the wood from? What is happening? And, at least ask the question of what is the process of slash management on this forestry practices? And that will help us inform the team to make the right decisions. The last piece that we also looked at was transportation. And that's a huge, huge piece, part of that equation of calculating emissions. So for example, if we're doing a project in Dallas, do we really want to pick a wood that's coming from Northwest US, right? That's a long transportation process, and it adds a huge, emissions value. So, combined between forestry practices, combine that with the type of wood that we select, and also, by the way, select where it's coming from or being fabricated. All of those decisions really impact. So at the end of the day, what we cannot do is say, mass timber is good or bad in one bucket. There are so many nuances and decisions along the way that are important. And if we pay attention to those, I think we can adjust and really improve the emissions values for mass timber.
Now, biogenic carbon emissions, are those different from other carbon emissions?
Yeah, well, biogenic carbon really refers to the carbon that is sequestered in a living organism, that trees, over its life. That's one of the reasons, right? Like when we start with a tree, your emissions value is actually way negative because over the life of the tree, it has sequestered carbon and stored it within the tree. So that's really what biogenic carbon means.
Mhm.
And when we take it and when we take that wood and put it in a project as mass timber product, you're in essence holding that carbon within the building. So instead of emitting, you have this negative value. Um, but the slash, again, which got left behind in the forest, there's also a time value to this. So the slash that is left behind in the forest, if you burn it, you're immediately re-releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. So now something that would have taken longer periods of time to re-release back in the atmosphere or never been released,
Mhm.
um, uh, that is the piece that we are kind of trying to account for.
So tell us about the tool that Corgan has created for mass timber design.
When we conducted this research and we wrote a white paper on it and we kind of explained this whole process, ran an analysis, we realized, I mean, this could become a tool that could be useful for design teams, for ownership teams, really kind of just play around and understand how these different variables impact the overall emissions values. So we created a tool called the Corgan Mass Timber Carbon Calculator. And what that tool really does is it's a really simple tool. It's on our website. And you go there and you first, select the building size. That will automatically calculate the volume of mass timber that will be applied in the building. And then you select the species of wood that you're applying in the building, and it gets into the even the sort of the specificity of columns versus slabs, and are you using CLT from pine or hardwood from Northwest? And once you select those things, and also if you know the process of slash management, you can select that. That is all part of the A1 stage of LCA studies. And then there's a second piece to that, which I was talking about before, which is the transportation. So we have another one where we have A4, which is the transportation stage, and we allow you to select any of many of the mass timber providers in the country, and you select where your project is, and it calculates the amount of distance that mass timber is traveling. When you put it all together, it gives you an overall value, which is a number that kind of gives, this is again not a full LCA analysis, but it's
Mhm.
giving you the values for A1 and A4 that you can then use to input into your full LCA analysis. So, it can turn into something that's really for the nerds and carbon world. And we kind of appreciate that. But I think it's also a really good tool for designers to at least go in and see, what does my decision mean? If I'm trying to do this building, which is 5 stories tall and this many square feet, what happens if I pick, again, southern pine versus another species of wood? And what happens if we change the way the slash is managed? So immediately you start to see the impact of your decisions. That's really where we want to make an impact is, you can't simply say, oh yeah, we want to use mass timber. Let's get into the specifics of where it's coming from, how it's being managed, and see how that impacts your overall carbon emissions. So our process really was starting with information gathering, understanding the biomass, what's left on site, what accounts for all the slash. That is really the part of biogenic carbon. That is the part of carbon that goes into the A1 stage of the LCA calculation. And then the other piece is really the location and transportation of carbon. Um, those two together are like sort of the key variables that we wanted to address, mainly the slash carbon, but then also couple that with transportation. So we figured out different variables that go into calculating those two particular stages. And as you select the scenario, the slash management scenario, the location of your project and the manufacturer or where that timber is coming from, we combine that together and you're able to come up with the additional carbon that needs to be put into the one-click LCA or LCA analysis. So the idea was really to kind of focus on those two particular stages. The one on the left, which has to do with slash management, that's really the critical one. And then you add the transportation piece as well. And then you come up with a final adjustment value that goes into your LCA analysis. And what we did was we added a third step to that and took that, plug that value into an analysis for a typical office building that was comparing, mass timber structure as against typical concrete and steel. And what we found at the end was that mass timber still comes out a better product in terms of embodied carbon. And all of this process turned into a calculator, the Corgan Mass Timber Carbon Calculator, which is now living on our website. So this is the important diagram that really explains where, the life of a tree from the tree to the point where it ends up as mass timber in our buildings. So at the moment, typically our calculations for life cycle assessment on mass timber begins after the log is taken out from the forest. What we are looking at is what happens at the forestry level. And as you can see in this diagram, a large portion of that tree from where it was in the forest to the building is lost in that process of harvesting, manufacturing, transporting. A lot of that wood is lost. So, and if you look at this diagram again, the biggest chunk is 25% is that slash. The slash is that piece of, or the portions of that tree that are left behind in the forest. That is the one that we focused on in our research. That is the one we figured out different variables that account for the emissions based on your wood species, based on the management practice. All of those things impact the amount of emissions that happen due to the slash that is re-releasing carbon in the atmosphere. It's an important diagram for us to understand that not everything from that tree ends up in our buildings.
What has been the initial reaction of the industry?
I'll tell you, most people that we have spoken with have really appreciated this. Since that WRI report that came out, in 2023, I know there was a lot of discussion within our industry about what that means. There was a lot of conversation around whether that should even be included within the boundaries of what we calculate. And that debate is ongoing. But from industry leadership, whether it's the Carbon Leadership Forum folks or some of our other friends in Architecture 2030, they've all appreciated what we have tried to do. We actually had a researcher who used to be with University of Washington and now with CLF peer review our paper. So And look, I don't think this is by any means the final output or outcome of our research. We all know that embodied carbon is something that's still kind of being developed, not just for mass timber, for other products as well. So it's an area where we have to start, we have to keep that debate going.
Hmm.
And the end goal is to try to really understand and figure out the process and methods by which we are making sure that we're accounting for every part of the life of a product, right? And not missing out on things that seem to be relevant, as the WRI report pointed out for this one. So I think, I would say we have had pretty positive response. I think the piece where we want to continue to work on is to find a way to make this even more user friendly for designers, maybe expand it and include all stages of mass timber emissions or something like that. But so far it's been really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly beautiful looking. So I think people have a tendency to think that it's all natural and all
Yeah. No, and
neutral, I should say. Yeah.
yeah. And the other benefits of mass timber are so much, right? And um just from the health perspective, like we know, just the touch and feel of wood in the spaces that we occupy, that has a huge impact on not just our physical well-being, but mental health,
Mm.
well-being. And, I have had conversations on projects where we have been discussing use of mass timber where an owner or a developer sees other disadvantages. Let's say a site is not the most desirable site in the city, right? You bring in mass timber and develop a project using mass timber that overtakes and overcomes some of those challenges that might otherwise exist for a particular site. So there's so many other advantages of incorporating mass timber. I think this is just an added piece. And our goal is really kind of stay ahead of that curve and make sure that we are understanding the overall impact in terms of carbon. And again, that's also something that we see a lot of our clients interested in from that perspective of ESG goals, making
Mm.
sure that their scope 3 emissions are taken care of, and mass timber comes out a winner in from that perspective.
This has been great. As a media person, I'm always wondering what my guests are reading or listening to that can inform on the topic. Of course, people should read your research on the topic,
Yeah.
but is there anything else there about mass timber or about sustainability in general that you would recommend?
Hmm. You got me there because the stuff that I've been interested in and reading in has been a little more around the urban scale. I used to lead planning and design for Battery Park City Authority in Lower Manhattan, so I've been
Oh,
very interested in how cities function and how do you think about a sustainable future of cities in everything from climate change to economics. And so my latest read has actually been a book called Greater Than Ever, The Great Comeback Story of New York, written by Dan Doctoroff.
oh,
I don't know if
mm-hmm.
you've heard of
Yes,
him, but
yes.
him when he was working with Bloomberg, they really came right after 2001, the September 11th event, and worked hard to bring New York back to its economic success and power. And so, I always look at those kind of factors and how things have really changed now with the climate change impact. In Manhattan, New York, especially, and many cities now, we're concerned with impacts of, whether it's coastal resiliency or heat stress and
Mm.
how that's starting to impact our populations in urban centers. So it's a little different than mass timber, but that's the book that I'm reading right now.
Oh, great. I'll have to find that one. Um, Varun, thank you very much for coming and sharing your work with us.
Thank you. Therese, can I say a little bit about our team who has
Of
really worked on
course.
this?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. So just Corgan established our group called Echo, and we branded it Echo, which is essentially our sustainability subject matter experts. And we've got an amazing team. We started about 2 years ago, and we've got some really expert members here between New York, Dallas, and London. And we're focused on everything from supporting our design teams on their individual projects, everything from analytics to lead or other kinds of certifications. We consult directly with our clients on embodied carbon and some of the other consulting work. And then we also take care of our internal, scopes 1, 2, and 3 accounting and emissions calculations and all the corporate sustainability that comes along with it. Um, and we have another group that's called Hugo, which is our research arm. And Echo and Hugo have kind of worked together on this particular research effort and really brought together, people who understood sustainability and people who know how to conduct a research process. Because we were able to do this in a very lean and very quick way, be able to dive in, figure out what the problem is, what the question is, and how we answer that in a more meaningful way. So I just wanted to take a minute to kind of mention that because without that team we wouldn't be able to solve this thing so quickly.
Yeah, I think the AEC field has really been kind of the thought leaders on
Yeah,
sustainability and carbon reduction. So we
yeah.
appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for the time.
Okay.
Appreciate getting on this podcast with you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining me on Sustainability Street. If you have any questions about this episode or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to me at therese.fitzgerald@cpe-mhn.com. Bye for now.